Hello, and welcome to the Insight LSAT Prep Course. This is the 8th and final lesson in our series. I hope you've been finding these videos helpful. Today, we'll be talking about timing and test-taking strategies. These will mostly go hand in hand. As I've said many times before, we begin preparing for the LSAT by learning the different parts of it, slowly, carefully, thoughtfully, without the stress of time pressure. But eventually the day comes when you have to put it all together and perform in timed conditions. Today's lesson is all about that moment. Here's the plan. I'll start with an overview of my general approach to timing on the LSAT. I'll then give you specific tips for each section, LR and RC. After that, we'll go through a few loosely related points that aren't organized in any special way. First, I'll address the issue of whether to aim for all of the questions on the test or just do some of them. Then I'll talk about a time crunch strategy that can be helpful for some people who are trying to speed up. Next, I'll address the annoying question that every modern test taker needs to make a decision about. Do you take the test at home or at a testing center? I'll then talk about the idea of the LSAT as a mental marathon and how this should impact your preparation. And finally, I'll say a few things about the LSAT writing section before wrapping up with some concluding remarks. Let's start with an overview. Perhaps the most important piece of advice that I can give you right now for trying to improve your timing on the LSAT is to not try to improve your timing on the LSAT. I cannot stress this enough. It's so easy to get overwhelmed in the beginning. You take a PT and the timing is super intense. You wonder how you can ever do it. The key is to take a longer-term perspective. The LSAT is designed to require extensive preparation over the course of months. You need to learn to walk before you can run. Give yourself some time, at least a whole month, to not worry about timing. You're doing yourself a disservice otherwise, because you're not going to be able to develop the fundamental skills if you're stressing out and trying to move quickly. Just like with anything else, you'll get better and faster by practicing. Just let that process unfold naturally before you address timing directly. So the first tenet of my approach is to delay working directly on timing. This is something I've said a few times before in the course, but it is worth emphasizing again. I do recommend regular practice tests, usually one per week or one every other week in the beginning, so those can serve to give you a little timed work all throughout. But the focus should be on developing your skills, and that should be done primarily in untimed conditions. In fact, as far as I'm concerned, there's a really easy way to know when to transition to timed practice. This is the point at which you achieve your target score on an untimed practice test. Now you know that you understand things well enough to meet your goal. The next step is to achieve these results under pressure, so that's when I suggest you begin timed work. The next major aspect of my approach to timing is to work dynamically and make this test your own. The primary tool that you've got at your disposal here is skipping. Now, I don't mean skipping entirely. By the end of the section, you must have an answer selected for every question. But that doesn't mean you have to do them all in order. I'm a big fan of skipping questions initially and then coming back to them later. What this enables you to do is work on the easier questions first. Get the easy points locked in. Build your confidence, avoid panicking, and importantly, bank time. Not every question on the LSAT deserves the same amount of time. Easier ones take less time, while harder ones take more time. So if you do all of the easier ones first, and you do them quickly, you'll bank the time that you need to use for harder questions. We'll talk a lot more about skipping when we get to the section-specific advice. I just wanted to emphasize for now that it's a really important central aspect of my approach to timing on the LSAT. I don't like to get bogged down in a question. I like to move nimbly through the section, grabbing the easier points, skipping questions that seem hard, and then circling back to them later. As you make your way through a section, you actually have 4 ways of marking a question. You may not see it this way at first, but if you think about it, it's true. This is mostly because of the flag function. Both on LawHub and on the Insight training platform, it is possible to flag a question while you're taking a section. It then shows up as flagged on the bottom of the page in the line of answer bubbles. So, as you pass by a question, there are 4 ways to mark it. First, you can answer it, filling in the bubble. Second, you can leave it without choosing an answer, and then the bubble will stay blank. Or you can flag either one of these. This is actually a pretty powerful and underappreciated aspect of the modern test. I used to do something similar back when I took the test, when it was administered on paper and pencil. I would make these little marks on the Scantron sheet. I would put a little open circle next to the question number if I skipped the question entirely. I'd put a little dash next to it if I answered it but thought that I may have gotten it wrong. And I'd put a little dot next to it if I answered it and probably got it right but just wanted to double check. This was so important for me because it meant that I didn't have to be totally sure about an answer before moving on. In addition to fully committing to an answer, I knew that I had 3 other options. I could skip it entirely, I could mark it as problematic, or I could mark it as one that I wanted to go back and double check. This enabled me to move much more quickly through the questions so that I would actually usually have extra time at the end, and then I would use that time in a strategic manner. Of course, first I had to go back and answer any questions that I skipped entirely, but then I would go back and look at the ones that I thought I might have gotten wrong. And then, only if I had time, I would go back to the ones that I wanted to double check. Now, you certainly don't have to do any of this if you find it confusing or annoying, but just be aware that you have something similar at your disposal with the modern test. If it were me, I would leave the bubble blank if it's a true skip. I'd fill it in normally if I'm committing to the answer, and I'd flag the filled in bubble if I made a choice but would like to double check. Then I'd flag a blank circle if I either chose an answer that I fear is wrong or narrowed it down to 2 but couldn't decide. This last move is a little tricky technically. If you actually bubble in an answer choice, then you can't leave it open. So what I'd probably do is hide everything that I'm not considering. Even if I'm quote-unquote selecting A for now, the way I'd do that is by hiding answer choices B through E. More likely, however, if I actually think I'm in danger of getting it wrong, that's probably because there's at least one more strong contender, so I would leave that one unhidden as well. Okay, let's get into some section-specific advice now. We'll start with LR. Remember, each section is 35 minutes long, and LR sections have 24 to 26 questions. If you do the math, that means you have initially about 80 seconds to do each question. But, in line with our general approach, we shouldn't expect to spend 80 seconds on each. Some questions need to be faster than that. I've gone as low as answering a question in 25 seconds, though that is quite rare. On the other hand, some questions need more time. On the hardest ones, I may take 3 minutes or more. But the only way we'll be able to work dynamically like this is if we have a strategy. One of the most important aspects of my own LR timing strategy was what I call 10 in 10. The concept is simple. You get 10 minutes for the first 10 questions, which are typically the easiest ones in this section. Now, notice this is not the same as 1 minute per question. It's more dynamic than that, because there's still variety and difficulty in the first 10. I always had at least a few 30 to 45 second questions in that early range. But then these would be balanced out by ones that took 1 minute 15 or 1.5 minutes. The point is that I would shoot to finish the first 10 in the first 10 minutes. I wouldn't always hit it. Sometimes it was 10 in 11 or 10 in 12, but that didn't matter so much. Striving for 10 in 10 helped me to make sure that I didn't spend more time than is necessary for easier questions. Here, a stopwatch is going to be indispensable. The test-taking portal has a timer, but that counts down. You need to count up. It's much easier to just glance at your stopwatch and see that you're on minute 7 than it is to see that you have 28 minutes left, meaning you've already used 7 of the 35. So count up and not down. I would glance at my stopwatch after pretty much every question, checking where I am in terms of my 10 in 10 goal. Okay, question 5 and I'm still on the 4th minute. Awesome. Or, question 2 and I'm already 3 minutes in. Gotta pick up the pace. Now, you might try, at some point, to expand this strategy out a bit and make it 15 and 15. But that's going to be way less important and also less achievable. I used to think of that as bonus time if I could pull it off. Still, starting with 10 and 10 is a really nice way to bank some time on this section. It'll build a nice base of time and points to power the rest of your performance. After that, you're going to want to develop a more personalized strategy for skipping. I just spoke about the 10 and 10 in terms of the first 10 questions. Technically, I don't mean questions numbered 1 through 10. I mean the first 10 questions that you do, because skipping in the beginning is okay as well. I wouldn't do it as much, but there is the occasional medium-level question in that range, and sometimes you just don't want to deal with that in the very beginning. Anyway, you need some kind of strategy for skipping, if you're going to make that a part of your test-taking process. To start, you don't want to be skipping around like crazy, back and forth all the time. That will be confusing and lead to mistakes. I like to think of things in terms of passes, where honestly, you're only probably going to do a first and a second pass. So I would make my way through the whole section in order, but at each question, I'd ask myself whether or not to do it. I'd skip some, but then by the time I got to the end, at least I'd know that I'd seen everything and that I had a chance to tackle all of the ones that I thought were easy. I'd then circle back for a second pass and do the ones that I'd skipped. To begin creating your LR skipping strategy, I'll say that you should always skip parallel structure questions. They objectively take the longest as a question type, so I would just skip them as soon as I see them. After that, here are some other options for thinking about things. First, you might have a rule about skipping after a certain period of time, maybe depending on where you are in the section. But I could see something like, skip as soon as you hit the 2-minute mark on a question. And this is related to a second option, which is to skip when you feel stuck. I can't tell you how often I would find myself racking my brain, going back and forth between two answer choices, only to skip the question, move on to some other ones, and then come back and immediately see something totally obvious that I missed the first time around. Especially when we're under pressure, we can get into cognitive ruts. You keep thinking about things the same way, so you don't make progress. Banging your head against the question won't always solve it, so sometimes it's better to just free up your mind and work on some other stuff. Then you come back with a fresh approach and you see what you missed before. Next, another option is to have a question type based approach. Maybe you just hate inferences or necessary assumption questions, and your accuracy on them is lower than on other question types. It might be a good idea to just skip these as soon as you see them. You can then come back later, once you've banked time, points, and confidence, and try them in more relaxed conditions. A final option is to give the passage a super quick skim and then decide whether or not to skip it. Sometimes you can tell pretty quickly that a passage is going to be challenging. Maybe it's really long, or maybe it's about subject material that you find challenging. Some examples of this might be really scientific or statistically oriented passages. Or, usually for a different group of people, passages that are really abstract or philosophical in nature. Or maybe it's not the subject material per se, but just a really confusing set of statements. Spending 10 to 20 seconds scanning a passage and then deciding to push it to later is not a waste of time. When you come back to it, you'll still remember it, at least roughly, and this will make your actual read-through that much smoother. Okay, so try out 10 and 10 for sure. It's an extremely powerful technique. But then, consider making your own personal strategy for skipping on the first pass-through. You can incorporate the 4 ways of marking that I mentioned before if you'd like. For now, let's move on to RC. Remember, each RC section has 4 passages. I like to think of this as meaning I get 8 minutes per passage, though of course I'm going to want to spend that time unevenly. And yes, I know that 8 times 4 is 32, and you actually have 35 minutes, but by thinking of it this way, I end up with bonus time instead of playing a really dangerous game. Anyway, the first thing to do is to figure out how much time you're going to spend reading and how much on questions. I'd say 2 to 4 minutes is the range to shoot for when it comes to reading, though I'd be very careful with these endpoints. 2 minutes is not much more than a skim, and I can only see this as a viable time if you're mostly just mapping the passage and planning to come back. On the other hand, 4 minutes doesn't leave a lot of time for the questions, so you'll have to make up time there. If, after a lot of practice, you can't seem to get below a 4-minute passage time without a significant drop-off in accuracy, you should consider just doing 3 out of the 4 passages, though I'll come back to the partial completion strategy in a moment. You might be wondering at this point how you can learn to read faster. And here I have to be candid. That's a difficult thing to do. But it is possible, and I have 2 main suggestions. The first is to work up to speed. During your untimed preparation phase, read slowly and carefully. Use the bullseye to parse longer sentences and paraphrase the ideas. Insist on understanding. This becomes easier over time, and you'll actually end up reading more quickly than if you had just started off trying to go fast without developing the underlying skills. You can also improve in the same way by reading the non-LSAT material that I discussed in Lesson 7. Check out some open access academic journal articles, or read certain magazines. By immersing yourself in this more difficult material and insisting on understanding all throughout, you can improve your reading abilities, and this will translate into faster reading times. Now, my second suggestion here is to shift yourself more toward the mapping side of our reading styles spectrum, away from internalizing and toward mapping. If you set out mostly just to figure out where the stuff is in the passage, instead of trying to fully understand everything, you can move more quickly. The more you do this, though, the more you will also have to practice going back to the passage during questions. Also, getting better at seeing the RC matrix will be very helpful here. When it comes to how much time to spend on questions, things can vary pretty drastically. Some questions, like an author's tone one that says, "What is the author's tone toward pizza?" and then gives 2-word answer choices, may take only 20 seconds. A tough inference question, on the other hand, may take 2 minutes. So be aware of this and embrace it from the outset. Expect to spend more time on some questions in RC than on others. As for skipping in RC, I still like it as a major part of your strategy, though I don't recommend leaving passages and then returning to them later. Better, I think, is to skip internally among questions in the same passage. So here you have smaller cycles of first pass and second pass. Instead of going all the way through the section before circling back, you go all the way through the passage before circling back. Now, the main point or main purpose question will almost always be first, and you probably shouldn't be skipping this one. Though it's not the end of the world if you do, and I could actually see a legitimate strategy built around doing this, at least sometimes. First off, you have to admit to yourself that you're in a suboptimal situation. You really should have identified the main point while reading, but if you couldn't do that, or maybe you've narrowed it down to 2 or 3 answer choices, I could see skipping the main point question and then moving on to do all of the mentioned detail questions. These are the ones that explicitly mark a portion of the text and then ask you to say something about it. The reason you could try to do these first is that they force you to go back and read parts of the passage again, and that's a way of developing your overall understanding. Maybe by returning to the text a couple of times, you'll start to get a better sense of the overall picture. Then you can come back to the main point question, and maybe you'll see what you were missing before. I'd be very wary about doing inference questions until you get the main point one, though. This is because your general understanding of the passage is what is going to incline you towards some inference answers rather than others, and the test is designed to trick people who don't have the right total picture in mind. Besides the main point question, I would just skip for the same sorts of reasons that I mentioned in LR. Generally, that means skipping ones that seem hard or skipping when you're in a rut. Now, the last thing I'll say about RC passages is that you are under no obligation to do them in the order in which they are presented. Following the easy to hard policy, I usually suggest people skim all of the passages super quickly, under 10 seconds per passage, just to see what's going on in the section. Then, start with whichever one appeals most to you. Maybe you just like the arts passages a lot, or you like the science ones. Start with that. Or perhaps you actually know something about the topic. It's about jazz music, and you love jazz. Start with that. The other thing to keep in mind when choosing your passage order is the number of questions for each passage. Sometimes you'll have a 5-question passage, or an 8-question passage, or both. More than subject material, I would start with the 5 question, if there's one of those, and end with the 8 question if there's one of those. This is in line with banking time. You'll take less time doing the 5-question passage, and this will help you store up time for later. Okay, so in summary, for RC, you'll need to figure out how long you'll take for reading and how long for questions. This will vary from passage to passage, and your overall tendencies will depend on where you fall on the spectrum between the internalizing and mapping reading styles. You should also be aware that the time needed for questions varies, that skipping is still a viable strategy, and that the order in which you do the passages is up to you. We're moving now to our list of loosely related points. The first of these is the question of whether to do full sections or just aim for partial completion. It sometimes makes sense to ask whether to do the full test or just part of it. You can pretty easily figure out from your target score how many raw score points you'll need to achieve it, and then you can ask yourself where those points are going to come from. Now, there are 2 ways to go about things here. First, you can answer everything on the test with a certain accuracy percentage, and you can get your raw points that way. But another equally valid way is to not answer everything and thereby increase your accuracy percentage on the questions that you do attempt. This happens because you have more time to answer the questions, so you get more of them right. And sometimes, aiming at fewer questions this way increases your accuracy percentage so much that you end up with more points than you would have had you tried everything. So it's a totally legitimate strategy, at least for some test takers, to not aim at everything, but instead shoot for the questions you're most likely to get right in the first place, and then give yourself more time to answer them. Still, people often struggle to accept this strategy for psychological reasons. Maybe it just feels wrong to not answer everything, or maybe it feels like admitting defeat. But even if you're trying to get the highest score that you can, this can be a rational score-maximizing choice for certain people in certain situations. I've seen people take this approach to great success and end up exactly in the school of their dreams, and I've always admired them for taking a realistic, mature approach to the test. Now, if you do want to do just part of the test, you should make a plan. For RC, I think the only real decision is whether to do 4 passages or to do 3. If you do 3, now you have almost 12 minutes per passage. That gives more time for reading especially, but of course also more time for answering questions and probing the RC matrix for your citation lines. So if you want to do 3 passages, which 3 should you do? Well, generally there's a trend in the sections from easy to hard. Earlier passages tend to be a bit easier than later ones. But honestly, I have never found this trend to be particularly robust, so I don't recommend simply doing the first 3 passages. Rather, I recommend weighing 2 factors, the amount of questions and the subject material or topic. This is a similar point to the one I was making earlier, where I was talking about the order in which to do the passages, though here my recommendation is a little different. Whereas before I recommended starting with the 5-question passage, here I would probably recommend skipping that one entirely, if there is one. If you're not going to do an entire passage, I think it's best to make it the one with the fewest questions. But there's not always a 5-question passage. In that case, definitely do any 8-question passages that are there, but then after that, you can choose from among the 6 to 7-question passages one of those to skip. And here I would go based on subject material comfort. If you traditionally have hated the science passage and don't do well on it, just skip that one. If you're bad at the law passages, skip that one. All that being said, there's just one little adjustment I have to make here, an exception to what I just said about skipping the 5-question passage. If the 5-question one is a passage type that you really, really like, and there's a 6-question passage of a type you really hate, you should probably skip the 6th question, since the difference between 5 and 6 is small and may be overcome by the accuracy boost that you get from working with comfortable material. So that's RC. For LR, if you're not going to do everything, you should set aside a number of questions that you are going to attempt. A reasonable way to give yourself a little more breathing room would be to aim for around 20 questions instead of all 24 to 26. But it really does depend on your target score. a little simple math can help you figure out what you'll need. As for which LR questions you should actually attempt, here the difficulty curve is much more important. Everybody should be doing the first 15 questions, with the exception of the parallel structure questions, which I would skip entirely and immediately unless they look super easy. After that, you should go through the remaining 10 or 11 questions with a very liberal skipping strategy in mind. You're only aiming to do a small percentage of these, so the game becomes one of picking your battles. Try to find the easier ones. There are medium-level difficulty questions in the upper range, but they are surrounded by tougher ones. Can you find the medium ones and do those? Or maybe you want a strategy of targeting or avoiding certain question types. Anyway, keep going until you run out of time or hit the end of the section. Then either circle back or just guess for the rest. On that note, both for LR and RC, if you go the partial route, you still have to put an answer down for every question. There's no penalty for wrong answers on the LSAT, and an empty bubble is a guaranteed missed point. So, if you really didn't get a chance to narrow down a question at all, if it's a true guess, just pick your favorite letter between A and E and choose the same letter for every guess. This is statistically your best chance to get some points. You're admitting to yourself that you're not going to get all of them, but you're making it very likely that you'll scrounge at least a few of them. If you put just random letters instead, you're probably going to get nothing right. Okay, so that's full versus partial. Now, switching gears a bit, I want to talk about a time crunch strategy that's mostly intended for a very particular sort of test taker. This next topic is mostly for people who are aiming at a very high score, getting close to it, but falling short due to time pressure. If you fit that profile, or you end up fitting that profile at some point in your preparation, you might try the time crunch. By time crunch, I mean taking sections with less than 35 minutes available. I used to do this in the later stages of my preparation. I would take 30-minute sections instead of 35-minute sections. Honestly, it was a pretty miserable experience, and my scores suffered. But then, when I went back to 35 minutes, it felt a lot more roomy and comfortable, and my scores improved past what they were before. The idea behind this is the following. There's an ever-present challenge on the LSAT that actually applies to everyone every time they get a correct answer. You can never know for sure if you needed the time taken in order to get that correct answer. You got it right, but maybe you also would have gotten it right with 15 fewer seconds. Maybe you didn't need to double-check everything because your intuition was right from the very beginning. This is a problem you can't really avoid, but the time crunch indirectly addresses it by upping the time pressure and forcing you to make tough decisions. For me, this mostly had an impact in the earlier part of the LR section. I actually think this is how I came up with 10 and 10 in the first place. I started to go with my gut more in earlier questions, and I found that I could still get them right. This freed up otherwise wasted time that could then be used to get harder questions right. For RC, I also found that I could read faster than I realized and still get the questions right. So I freed up time to deal with harder questions or to go back and use the RC matrix to verify ones that I wasn't sure about. This had an appreciable impact on my score. So give the time crunch a try if you find that you're close to where you want to be, but think that timing inefficiency may be holding you back. You may find that this breaks you out of your plateau. All right, on to a very practical matter. Today's test is offered both in testing centers and from home. If your life circumstances make both of these options possible, which should you choose? Here I have to say that you might want to ask around a little bit. When I took the test, it was administered only in person, so personally I never had to grapple with this question. That being said, I do feel comfortable making a recommendation based on my experience tutoring people for the modern test, and my recommendation is pretty simple. Take it at a testing center if you can. From what my students have told me, taking the test at home seems like a stressful ordeal. There are all of these weird requirements that you need to meet, and then you have to scan your room multiple times with your camera. And then the proctors can interrupt you mid-test and ask you questions about your environment or your behavior. With months of preparation behind you, and given how important this test is for your career, I would not roll the dice on this one. At the time of making this video, I've already had 2 students who were unable to take the test on test day because the online proctoring somehow malfunctioned. Now, this could all change over time. Maybe LSAC just needs to work out the kinks. But until then, I would play it safe and just go to a testing center. It'll be a controlled environment. They'll supply you with a computer and reliable internet, a proctor, and some supplies, and then you just take the test. That's the way I would do it without a doubt. But by all means, if some of you viewers have a different take on things, start a conversation in the comments. I'd love to hear about your experiences. Anyway, that's what I think about where to take the test. Let's shift now to a cluster of issues that are somewhat external to the test, but still have a significant impact on it. I call this portion of things the LSAT as mental marathon. I've said many times that practice is the key to improvement on the LSAT, and I've built a whole website for preparing for the test called the Insight Training Platform. This sort of talk is not accidental. You should think of the LSAT like a mental marathon, and you should train for it in ways that are similar to the way in which you'd train for a running marathon. I'm talking here about training the whole person. You are more than a disembodied thinker of LSAT thoughts. You're a living, breathing human being, and your overall state of fitness and health has an effect on the sharpness of your mind and the quickness of your thoughts. With that in mind, I hope you'll permit me to make some suggestions that go a bit beyond the test itself. Some of this stuff is pretty obvious, but what's not obvious is how much of an impact it can have on your test-taking performance. One cluster of factors that you might be able to turn to your advantage involves lifestyle. For me, the biggest difference makers have always seemed to be sleep, diet, exercise, and stress. I know that life is complex, and I know it can be hard to make improvements in these areas, but if you think that there are any opportunities at all to have even a slight positive impact along these dimensions, I would very much encourage you to take them. Of course, I don't have much new to tell you here that you don't already know, but for sleep, aim for adequacy and consistency. Get enough of it and try to keep a regular sleep schedule. This will regulate your energy throughout the day. One cool thing about this is that you can figure out when during the day you're at your sharpest. Maybe that's morning, maybe it's midday, maybe it's late afternoon. You may be able to choose a testing time that fits your energy profile. As for food, you know what's healthy and what's not. In preparing for this mental marathon, a healthy diet can give you the stamina and energy you need to make gains and stay focused. Exercise can do the same, and it has the added benefit of relieving stress. Stress is a huge component in everyone's LSAT journey, and it influences things at each stage in different ways. Anything that you can do to relax just a bit will be helpful. Now, if you're the kind of person who likes to track your performance, consider including lifestyle notes in the LSAT data that you record. Suppose you get a lower score than usual on a PT. Is there something that explains that? Did you get enough sleep? Did you take the test at a weird time of day? Were there unusual stressors in your life? Or, on the other hand, suppose you get a better than average score. Why might that be? You can ask the same questions. Another aspect covered by the mental marathon concept is the fact that the LSAT requires a significant degree of mental stamina. Cognitive fatigue is a strange phenomenon, and it's still not fully understood by cognitive science. But I know firsthand that it's a very real thing, and you probably do as well. It seems to me that we can train our minds somewhat similarly to the way that we train our bodies, though, and to this day, I think that I was at my sharpest mentally while I was preparing for the LSAT. Merely preparing for this test will up your overall stamina, but there are also ways of addressing it more directly. One way to do this is to try something that I did in the later stages of my preparation. I would take what I called overloaded tests. Back then, the actual test was 5 sections long, so in my practice, I took 6-section tests, adding in a section from another PT. I even took an 8-section test at one point. The idea was to push through the fatigue and force myself to answer questions even when I felt tired and wanted to quit. When I went back to the regular 5-section tests, though, they felt almost short by comparison, and I was sharper throughout. These days, the real test is 4 sections long. With the 10-minute break, that's 150 minutes or 2.5 hours. Still, that's a long time to maintain full concentration. So, if you're up for it, try taking 5 or 6 section tests at some point later in your preparation. If you're really daring, take 2 back-to-back for an 8-section one. You'll be surprised at what it feels like to take the regular test after that. Now, I just mentioned a moment ago that you get a 10-minute break on the test. My second tip for addressing stamina revolves around this break. In keeping with the idea that LSAT test takers are in fact flesh and blood human beings, you might want to give some thought to having a snack, a little something to eat at that break. You're allowed to bring a snack. Now, some people get a little sluggish after eating, but I'm not sure if that's true with just a small snack. Anyway, I brought some trail mix in a water bottle filled with green tea. The thought was to give myself a little caffeine boost, some quick energy from the sugar in the dried fruit, and some more sustained energy from the nuts. If there's a snack or drink that helps you feel at your sharpest, bring this along for the mid-test break. And also, consume it during your break when you take PTs. This way, you can make sure that it has the right effect on you. How exactly you prepare for this mental marathon is ultimately going to be a very personal matter. People are different, and life is complicated. I guess my point here is just to remember that you're a whole human taking this test. So don't forget to take care of the rest of yourself as you're engaged in this long period of training. And now a few words about the LSAT writing section. I've put this off until now because it just doesn't matter nearly as much as the rest of the test. Remember, the writing section has no effect whatsoever on your score. The admissions committees do see it though, so you can't blow it off completely. I would suggest devoting a total of 1 day to preparing for the LSAT writing section. And what I would do is very simple. I would go back to my old YouTube series and watch lesson 7. I'll put a link in the description below. That's a half-hour video on the writing section. And in it, I actually go through the entire process of planning and writing an essay right there in front of you. Not much has changed over the years for the LSAT writing section, so pretty much everything I say there still applies. Watch that video and follow along with a younger version of me as I write the essay. Then, go into LawHub and take a look at the sample writing prompt that they give you there. Write an essay on that prompt according to the formula that I give you in the video. And then that's it. Just do it again when it's time to take the real one, which, by the way, you take at a different time than when you take the multiple choice portions of the test. Just search online for LSAC's official webpage on the writing section in order to get the most updated information about that. Okay, my friends, we are almost done here. I'd like to finish things off by giving you a brief summary of the course as a whole. I will then wrap up this lesson and the course with some concluding remarks. First off, congratulations on making it through the course. And bigger congratulations if you're back for a repeat watch. That shows real dedication. Anyway, we covered a lot of material in this course. Let's take a look back now at some of the more important points. In Lesson 1, way back then, I gave you an overview of the test and talked about how to prepare for it. I stressed a practice-based approach, and I encouraged you to focus on certain pre-specified skills and tools throughout. In Lesson 2, we laid some groundwork by talking about the fundamental topics that apply across the test. We discussed the challenging language that you'll see on the LSAT, we went over arguments, and we learned about conditional logic. This is a good lesson to keep going back to. Now that you know more about the test, you can put some of those skills in context and begin to apply them better. In Lessons 3 through 5, we talked about logical reasoning, or LR. I gave you an overview of the section where the main thing to understand is that the questions have types. In the beginning, you focus on the types, learning the strategies and drilling questions by type. As time goes on, you begin to integrate and take entire sections. There was a broad distinction that I made here between front-end questions, back-end questions, and questions without arguments, most of which were also back-end questions. We then tackled each of these groupings in the rest of Lesson 3, Lesson 4, and Lesson 5 respectively. I finished up with some advanced LR tips and suggestions for moving forward. In Lessons 6 and 7, we discussed reading comprehension, or RC. In 6, we focused on reading the passages. I introduced the 2 pillars of success and encouraged you to use this framework to both understand and improve your own reading style. In Lesson 7, we learned about the types of questions that typically appear on the RC section, though we were far less concerned with types than we were in LR. I talked about the RC matrix, a hidden structure operating in the background of the section, and I encouraged you to learn to see it. We then moved through an entire passage with questions, applying various aspects of the 2 pillars and also trying to discern the matrix. I finished up with some advanced RC tips and suggestions for making progress there. And then, finally, in today's lesson, Lesson 8, we talked about timing and test-taking strategies. I encouraged you to not worry about timing at first, but when the appropriate moment comes, to then work from easier to harder in order to bank time and points. I talked about the value of skipping and gave you some strategies for doing that effectively without things becoming chaotic. We also discussed a number of related topics, including the idea of the LSAT as a mental marathon. And now, it's time for you to really start your training for that marathon. This course was just the beginning. I've given you the fundamentals, but it's up to you to practice them and become the best LSAT test taker you can be. For those of you on the self-study track, I thank you for trusting me with the important task of teaching you at these crucial early stages. As somebody who went it alone myself back in the day, I wish you the best of luck going forward. Stay organized, stay motivated, stay focused, and you can make serious progress. For those of you on the Insight training platform, enjoy the ride. The platform will take you where you need to go, when you need to go there. It'll even tell you when it's time to take the test. Personally, I'll be spending a bit more time on that platform than I will on YouTube going forward. I'll be posting advanced content, developing new exercises, deepening our analytics, those sorts of things. So, if you decide to make the Insight training platform the foundation of your LSAT preparation, or if you've made that decision already, well, I'll see you there.